Good afternoon. Welcome to our second episode when dealing with the authenticity of the canonical Gospels. Last week, we introduced through the eyewitness testimony of Papias, who was a hearer of John the Apostle and a friend of two of those that followed Jesus, Aristion, and who he called John the Elder. And this week, we're going to pick up with the testimony of Papias. And we hope that you're able to join in and get involved in the questions and answers at the end as well. I'm going to open some time in this episode to discuss some of the content, discuss some of the hypothesis that I give, some of these different avenues about Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria. And then we're going to dive into some of the internal evidence as well, relating the Gospel of Mark today. We are a part of Explore Christianity for those who tuned in last week, and quite a few responses came through my personal messenger. I appreciate the positive responses. Had some good questions actually come in as well. Some of you actually invited me onto your programs, and I appreciate those opportunities. And this week, we're just going to pick up and continue on into this discussion. Again, please, if you want to leave a comment or some sort of question, I will examine these at the end of today's show, and we'll bring them in and do a little bit of Q&A at the end if you would like. I'm going to pull up some slides because sometimes that's the easiest way to do things, and I'm going to jump right in. And those that are listening on the podcast through Spotify, Apple Music, and other different avenues that do just the audio, I'm going to do my best to go slow through these, but I do want to read them to you as we go along. And one of the things that we're going to start with, as I stated before, is the testimony of Papias. I think that is probably one of the most important. And the reason I say that is because Papias is the one who knew actual apostles, and he knew John. He had testimony that corresponded way back to the days of Thomas and Peter and James. He mentions all of that in his introduction. Now, remember, as those may who have not watched that first video, Papias wrote a 5-volume introduction of the life and ministry of Jesus and his teachings. He claims that he received this information from the living and abiding voices, being the apostles themselves. And he actually stated that he wanted to continue his research, not from those that were on the outside necessarily, or from those who actually had theories, or really a romanticized version of it, but really those who actually knew the apostles themselves. He said, I would listen to them, I'd hear their testimony, I would compare them to what I learned from Aristion and John the Elder. And then we found out later that he also had correspondence with people like Philip, who was one of the seven there in the book of Acts, and his daughters, the virgin daughters, who are a part of that as well. So he had correspondence with them, and this is what he said about the Gospel of Mark, which is the one that he starts with, believe it or not. He starts with this one over against the writings of Matthew. Now, we're going to talk about why that's probably the case in a few weeks when we get to Matthew. But he starts with Mark. Now, there is great debate today as it relates to the Markan priority and the Matthean priority, and there's good explanation to why the church fathers held the view they did. Now, most today hold what's called a Markan priority in the academic world, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. I actually would hold to a Markan priority in some way, but it's going to be a little bit different than how people today relay it. It's not going to be that I believe it was the first gospel ever published, but particularly that it is the first Greek gospel published. And within the first Greek gospel, that's the one I believe why Papias started with Mark and his testimony. Reading the words of Papias, he said this, and the elder used to say, being John the Elder, Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote accurately all that he remembered, not indeed in order of the things said and done by the Lord. For he had not heard the Lord. Now, that's important to note because there's some theories that will come later that give the idea that Mark was actually there. In fact, later in the Gospel of Mark, when you're in the story of Jesus in the garden with the other eyewitnesses, one of the things that we note in that testimony is that there's an unknown man who was sieged or grabbed onto by one of the guards, and he ran away naked. Many have assumed or continued to make an argument for that was probably Mark. That's probably not the case at all. In fact, there's really no history that demonstrates that Mark knew Jesus, was there with Jesus, or traveled with Jesus. Now, I have a hypothesis of who that man was that we'll talk about later on. But here's what Papias says. He did not know the Lord, never followed him, never heard him, but later on followed Peter, who used to give teachings as necessity demanded by not making, as it were, an arrangement of the Lord's oracles, so that Mark did nothing wrong in thus writing down single points as he remembered them. For to one thing he gave attention, leaving out nothing of what he heard, and to make no false statements in them. This is recorded to us by Eusebius, and what he is telling us is Papias did not know Jesus personally, but had heard Peter, and he learned the teachings of Jesus from Peter and accurately wrote them down. So, a couple things. What did Papias mean when he used the word interpreter? It is the Greek word where we get our word hermeneutics. And there's a couple of ways we can look at this, because in the word itself that he used, hermeneutes, he's either saying he's interpreting, explaining, or translating, which is where some people land on this. And that's understandable too, because it can mean to translate in some contexts. So let's talk about the possibilities of what Papias is saying. He's saying, all right, so he interpreted or hermeneuo or gave some sort of hermeneutic to what Peter was telling him, and then he wrote it down. So what could that possibly be in its own context? One, here's a hypothesis. Mark gave interpretation to what Peter said. So Peter made statements, he interpreted them. Now, I would say that this one is not very likely, given this statement by Papias, recorded by Eusebius. For to one thing he gave attention, to leave out nothing of what he heard, and made no false statements in them. So he's not interpreting in the sense of taking a concept and saying, all right, this is what Peter's probably saying and giving its meaning. Rather, what he's doing based on this description later in the paragraph, he's taking and writing down everything that he heard and did not leave any opportunity to be misinterpreted. There's no false statements in them. They're accurate to what Peter told him. Interpretational perspective allows a large door to be open to mistaken or to leave mistake to what Peter said and meant. But if you're actually just saying what Peter said or writing what Peter said, the opportunity to be incorrect is smaller in margin than to give an interpretation of what you think somebody is saying. A second possibility is Mark took the original tradition that was verbal. Remember, Peter was probably not much of a writer, if at all. I may be one in the few minority that hold the position that Peter actually was probably partially illiterate. Peter was a fisherman. They went to school till about the age of 12. They learned Torah. They learned different avenues of probably Jewish interpretations of Torah, as well as learning the words themselves, and even went so far as to learn how to write maybe certain letters or even read certain letters, but that's about as far as they went. I wouldn't say he was completely illiterate, but he was probably mostly illiterate. And this is evidence in most anything Peter does. When we see Mark's gospel, for example, Papias is telling us that Mark's gospel is based on Peter's material. It could be Peter's oral traditions, meaning his sermons, what he preached in Rome. Mark would have recorded them for Peter. Peter's preaching, Mark's writing, he's taking the oral tradition, he's making it a written tradition. That could be the concept behind the idea of hermeneutics here, or his interpretation. here. And it's a valuable argument, I would say, because Peter's probably not a writer. I mean, you look at First Peter, for example, which is an undisputed book, and you see that Silvanus or Silas is the amanuensis, or if you would, the scribe behind his writing. And if this truly is Peter's gospel, as Papias is introducing to us, and he's having it written down by Mark for him, it stands to reason that Peter is more of a speaker than a writer. And that makes perfect sense when you look at Acts or you look at the gospels themselves. Peter's the one that's either doing the speaking on behalf of the group, or he's speaking on behalf of his own perspective, or he's getting his foot stuck in his mouth, or he's out on the front lines at Pentecost in Acts 2, and he is speaking boldly in front of that crowd. Either way, it is clear that Peter's more of an orator than a writer. And so it would make sense that Mark would have written things down for him. A third possibility, which is similar, is that Mark took Peter's message from one language, Aramaic, because it's very likely that he spoke Aramaic, and translated it into Greek. Now, being the fact that this was more than likely written in Rome, I don't think that Peter would have been speaking Aramaic in Rome. That would be more around the time and region of Judea and in the parts of Israel, not so much in the plains of Rome, or even if you went west further than that, or even if you went to the East churches, dealing with the churches there in Asia Minor, they would have been predominantly more Greek. Aramaic would have been more if he was writing to a Jewish audience, or speaking to a Jewish audience, I should say. But it could be that Peter didn't know Greek well, maybe. I doubt that's the case, but didn't know enough of it to have it translated. And so Mark would take Peter's words, put it into Greek, so that people in Rome could actually understand Peter. These are ideas behind what Papias meant by hermeneutic, or by his interpretation. And there's good reason to believe, I think, the last two more than the first one. I particularly would land with the fact that Mark was taking an oral tradition. Peter was preaching sermons in Rome, and he actually wrote down what Peter was teaching, and Peter would have reviewed it and approved it before publishing it. Now, with that, Irenaeus gives a little bit more insight to this as well. Now, keep in mind, Irenaeus is a very important church father as well. He was trained by Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, who was commissioned and trained by John the Apostle himself. He was ordained and placed in an apostolic position in Smyrna, and Polycarp took under him. Later, our guy here, Irenaeus. So Irenaeus learned a good bit of the tradition of the apostles, as he was a part of that early stage of transmission and the early stage of oral tradition and passing on these documents into the apostolic churches. And so this is what he had to say about it, which I think is a really good statement. Wherefore also Mark, the interpreter and follower of Peter. So we see unity behind what Papias is saying and what Peter is saying. He says, does thus commence his gospel narrative. So we have Irenaeus, we have Papias saying the same exact thing. And that was, in the 2nd century. A little bit further into the 2nd century, into the 3rd century, we have the lawyer Tertullian, who investigated much of the early church and the apostolic witnesses. And this is what he had to say about it. Mark was the interpreter of Peter. He said that in the Against Marcion. Now that's, again, 3 independent sources saying the same thing. And they're around the same time, because remember, we talked about Papias was around 60, probably died around the 120 mark, maybe a little earlier, give or take a few years. Irenaeus, not far removed, who spoke of Papias. Tertullian, not far removed from that. They're all saying the same thing, and then they're in different locations. And they're all saying that this Gospel of Mark is Mark interpreting something that Peter said while he was following him. Mark was an interpreter of Peter. Clement of Alexandria, go south here. We've got in the 2nd century as well, Clement of Alexandria saying Mark wrote Peter's teachings while Peter was alive. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, I've highlighted and underlined the words teachings while Peter was alive. Some have assumed and even hypothesized the idea that Peter was dead and Mark wrote something after the fact, that Mark's gospel was post 70 AD. He took what he remembered from Peter kind of out of knowing what he said, hearing his sermons over and over again, and produced something in written form much later in Peter's life. That's not the tradition that was given to guys like Clement of Alexandria. Now, let me tell you why Clement's important when it comes to the Gospel of Mark. You think, well, he's probably the least important because Mark was probably written in Rome. True. But keep in mind as we deal with this, that Mark, particularly after Peter's death, went to the area of Alexandria, went down to the area of Egypt, became a bishop in one of the apostolic churches in that region. So Markan tradition would have been very close at home to these churches like that Clement of Alexandria was in. And that goes also as we look into the testimony of Origen as well, who would have been in that same region originally. So you have Irenaeus saying, look, he's the interpreter and follower of Peter. That's what he did in his commencement of the gospel narrative. You have Tertullian saying the same exact thing. Papias said he received this tradition from John the Elder, one of those who was with Jesus. He actually told Papias it was Peter's gospel that Mark interpreted from his teachings. You have Clement of Alexandria saying not only is that the case, it happened while he was still alive. And Clement of Alexandria is not that far removed from when Mark would have likely died in that same region that he is in the apostolic churches. So that leads us to our next guy, who's a few years after that in the same exact region, Origen. Origen said this, the second gospel. Now note that he says it was the second gospel. Now, we're going to explain this whole Markan priority. We're going to explain this whole Matthean priority when we get to Matthew more than Mark. At this point, I actually think Origen is right. I think Mark is the second gospel that was sent out, but I do think it was the first Greek. Mark is the first Greek gospel that was published. And as we get to Matthew, you'll see my argument for that more and more laid out. But the second gospel was that according to Mark, who wrote it according to Peter's instructions. So Origen's getting the concept here that Peter actually instructed Mark what to write, which goes hand in hand with what Papias was saying earlier. Remember, Papias is making the argument that when you look at the interpretations of Peter that Mark gave to him, he did it without any falsehood, and he did it exactly as how he heard it. Now, what this is indicating to us is that there was likely some sort of fact-checking, or maybe Mark read through his material and Peter approved and said, no, change that or word that differently, or try to make this be the point more than this the point. Whatever it was, Peter was involved in this gospel, but not as the writer, but as the narrator giving the story, the orator that's telling the mystery of this Jesus guy to these Gentiles in Rome. He's unveiling him to them by giving them instruction on this is what Jesus said, this is what Jesus did, and he highlights the ministry and life and teachings of Jesus. Now, there's another document, it's a very important document in the late 2nd century, known as the Anti-Marcionite Prologue of Mark. Now, it covers the Gospels in general, and unfortunately, we don't have everything that it says, but there are fragmented senses that we could pretty much say this is probably late 2nd century, later, maybe into the 3rd century, but I tend to believe it's more late 2nd century into that 3rd century mark. And one of the things that we note about the Anti-Marcionite Prologue says this about Mark. Mark recorded, who is called Stumpy Finger, because he had fingers that were too small for the height of the rest of his body. He himself was here it is, interpreter of Peter. Now, catch that. One of the things that I want to make note of is when we're looking at the Marcionite Prologue here, is that when Mark goes into when he goes into the description of Mark, he has a physical description of him. What's the physical description? His fingers. There was a physical attribute about Mark that was recorded. Not just that he was a writer, not that just he followed Peter, not that just he interpreted Peter, but actually there's something quite incredible here, that he himself had a physical presentation that was known in the churches that remained in tradition. His body and his finger sizes didn't look like they coordinated well. So he was given a nickname, what we would say in English, stumpy finger, because the fingers were not big enough to fit the rest of his body. But apparently his finger sizes were good enough to at least hold a pen and write down the words of Peter. But I think that's important because it's not just saying a general statement about Mark or just repeating somebody else's information. It seems to me that the anti-Marcionite prologue actually has a tradition about the physical man himself and his looks, which to me is not somebody just trying to make something up. You're actually focusing in on a tradition about the man and his writing. But notice what it says. He himself was the interpreter. That's consistent with Irenaeus. That's consistent with Papias and Tertullian. He is the interpreter of Peter. Jerome in the West said this: Mark was a disciple, and here it is, interpreter of Peter. He wrote a gospel that Peter approved of, as Clement and Papias said. So Jerome, recognizing as one of also a leader and a historian of the Church of Rome, engaging with the object of hypothesis that's presented by Papias and Clement, and says, hey, that is accurate. And my discoveries, my research has shown that he is an interpreter of Peter, just as Papias discovered and just as Clement discovered. Now, these are external things, and they're good. The external evidence is something we should consider. But we can really summarize all of these things, because these are independent witnesses who are saying the same thing. So if we are corroborating them and we're taking their testimony into consideration as independent witnesses, we can literally take everything and summarize it this way. Mark was traveling with Peter while he was in Rome. Peter was teaching orally the traditions of Jesus that he saw and heard with his own eyes and ears, and he was teaching them to Gentiles in Rome. His life was under threat, and Mark was apparently a good scribe and able to write down and collect what Peter said while he was living, share with what he's writing. Peter would approve or disapprove what he did, and finalize this collection of sayings about Jesus and his teachings and his miracles and his work and his death, his burial, and his resurrection, published this written text to continue the eyewitness testimony of Peter to the world after Peter had died and his oral tradition went with him. That's pretty much what's happening in these testimonies. But there's something that we need to consider with the external witnesses. And this is something I ran into on social media today, and I want to approach this. The idea that all the Gospels are equal, that being the canonical Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels, or any apocryphal works given gospel names or narratives. The thing that must be understood is that what separates these Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, apart from the rest is that you have historically from independent sources the ability to construct a person of interest or people of interest and to identify individuals, not just 1,500 years later, within the same lifetime of some of these writers, whether you're talking about Papias, whether you're talking about Irenaeus, whether you're talking about guys like Clement, or guys that were around when Mark was alive, or in the same regions that Mark ended up being bishop of churches in. Whatever you're looking at, you're talking about within the same lifetime, individuals from different parts of the world able to independently state how they understood from the individuals themselves or friends of the individuals, how these Gospels came into existence. You cannot do that with any of the other Gospel accounts. You can't do that with the Gospel of Thomas. You can't do that with the Gospel of Mary. You can't even do that with the Gospel of Peter or the Gospel of Truth. They do not exist where we have a corroborated effort of independent materials looking together in their sources to align individuals to produce documents with narrative, story, and detail a figure of a person, like the anti-Marcionite prologue of Mark's fingers being too small for the rest of his body. Things like we don't have that in any other of the ancient gospel texts. And that needs to be stated. The accusation that's received on this side of things from skeptics, atheists, and those in the secular scholastic world have placed us in the category of Christianity and its church fathers and its historians as bias. Now, they were not biased to all accounts. If the accusation is that these individuals are pushing a bias agenda, one must ask this question: why were they not biased to all writings that made Jesus a hero? In fact, why weren't they biased to gospels like Peter's actual gospel, which gives the most vivid, detailed description of the gospel and how Jesus resurrected from the dead? I mean, listen, if you want to go through the four gospels, what you don't find is play-by-plays. The moments, the greatest moments in history when the Messiah broke through death, resurrected to life, defeated his enemy, and was accomplishing all that the prophet said he would do. You think if eyewitnesses were going to give you a story, it's that one. But in the four gospels that we have, all they attest to is that the tomb was empty when they got there. And the women's report that they would receive from the women that were there, and from the message of the angels that were given to the women. The Gospel of Peter, details, play-by-play. Jesus coming out of the tomb, being held up by two angels on both shoulders. Then this divine voice from heaven. And then this answer coming out of the tomb from the giant cross. All this weird symbolism and Gnostic Docetism that seems to be coming out all of a sudden. But you have a play-by-play. Why would the churches not accept that one as Peter? It is more detailed and better descriptive in the moments of resurrection than the four gospels. Because they didn't have a bias. They had a story that was delivered to them by the living and abiding voices. I'll steal Papias's phrase. And the living, abiding voices told them how it happened. And they received later from the living and abiding voices documents that were written by aides, such as Mark or Luke or others that published other gospels like Matthew's, received the same message from authentic sources, authentic writers that could be traced to the same people they heard the oral tradition from and were passed on to, and were able to find unity and testimony between what they heard and what they read. It's not bias. It's being cautious. And it's actually making sure you're getting the right story. Papias did the same. He even said, if I get a testimony from somebody saying, oh, I learned this from Thomas, or I learned this from Peter, or I learned this from John, he questioned them. Why? Because the churches were not open to anything that made Jesus look good. They were open to the truth. And what they learned from the living and abiding voices and the apostolic witnesses when they were alive. And the churches concluded in all the regions of the world, by the way, four gospels were consistent with that testimony, and that they received these four gospels from authorized writers, scribes, and messengers who took these letters to them, and all other gospel narratives that came in were instantly rejected because the sources were not traced to the living and abiding voices and to those who taught them in their lifetime. There was no dispute. That needs to be understood. No dispute about the four gospels in any of the churches. I don't care if you're in the West. I don't care if you're in Rome. I don't care if you're down in North Africa. I don't care if you're in Alexandria, Egypt. I don't care if you're in the regions of Jerusalem, in Syria, and in the regions of the east of the apostolic churches that were started by Paul and John. Wherever you are, all of the stories and the narratives and the speakers and the historians have stated the same thing. These four gospels go back to these sources. There's no dispute. No fifth possible gospel was ever introduced by any of the churches in the world. And they didn't have email. They couldn't call each other up and have a phone call about it. They couldn't conspire in a secret meeting behind closed doors and say, all right, let's go back to our respective regions. Let's tell this story. This is how it goes. They could not do that. And at the same exact year ranges, they're all saying the same things about these apostolic testimonies from these gospels. And there's no dispute that Mark's gospel is Peter's gospel. We in Christianity who have these gospels historically and currently can defend them as having a person of interest behind them by corroborated evidence of independent resources and witnesses who knew the apostles and the writers personally. No other documents can do that. So to dismiss Mark as Peter's interpreter and to pose a hypothesis that the writers were some unknown first century Christian or Christians is to condemn somebody as guilty without ever producing an actual person of interest. Think about this. This would never work in a court of law. Somebody brings the evidence and says, I have witnesses. I have contacts. I have individuals who've stated from the people that wrote these gospels themselves, this is what happened. This is how it happened. This is where it happened. This is when it happened. And they're giving you the evidence from testimony. It's in written documents. We, 2,000 years later, just about, go, nah, there's no way that's true. That's Christian bias. The best debaters won out. And 325 AD at Nicaea, they picked the Gospels. Now, I don't know if you're watching this, you can watch on my program on my channel, Facts, Facts. If you go on Spotify, you can find me on there. On Facts, I did an entire episode on whether or not the four Gospels and the New Testament was picked and determined by the Council of Nicaea. Quick answer is it wasn't. There's no evidence for that. And I give all the reasons to where that myth came from and where it originated from in that video. I've done interviews on it. They're all over YouTube. And I've also done my own program on it on Facts. So if you missed that, please check it out. But that's not the way this happened. No council got together and chose the four Gospels. It just didn't happen that way. But here's the thing. In a court of law, if you're to produce all of these testaments, these united statements, these people of interest that seem to be the same, and you just say 2,000 years later, nope, not likely. This was the Christian communities making this up later. Okay, that's a hypothesis. Where do you get that from? Because what you got to do is not just create a person. You've got to dismiss the unanimous person of interest, Mark and Peter. You have to dismiss Tertullian, Papias, Clement, Jerome, Origen. You've got to dismiss all of them, not to include the fact that we have documents that are quoting these gospels as authoritative into the late second or into the late first century, into the early second century, like the Didache, First Clement, Second Clement, Epistle of Barnabas, Polycarp's epistle to the Philippians. You have to dismiss all of that, all of it, and create an unknown, unidentified person or people of interest that you cannot try. Well, it's post 70 AD by Christian communities. Which ones? Which person? Which church? You're telling us that out of the apostolic churches that remained, whether you're talking about Rome, North Africa, Syria, Jerusalem, the East, Alexandria, some unknown people brought these gospels together, distributed them to all of these churches, and they go, oh yeah, that's definitely Peter and Mark. Or that they, being on guard that they were, such as Papias, who was ready to fight and say, hey, look, you're claiming the apostle said this. I'm going to compare it to my notes because I talked to them. I talked to Aristion and John the Elder. I've heard John the Apostle. I've heard Philip. I've heard his daughters. They've been in my home. We've had dinner together. I'm going to compare what you say they said to what I know they said because I talked to them. The churches that are on that high alarm, where they are skeptical of any document, what you're saying is some unknown guy or guys, unknown scribes, unknown Christian communities from an unknown region distributed these gospels, and the churches get them in and go, yep, this is it. Let's make this our Bible. Let's make this our gospels. Let's call these the right ones, and everything else is wrong. We don't know where they came from. We don't know who delivered them to us. We don't know who wrote them. We don't know if they're true or not. They even contradict what we heard from John or we heard from Mark himself or we heard from Paul. But hey, we're going to accept these because we like these. I'm sorry. That is completely unrealistic and not how you do history. When people dismiss the hypothesis of the end that produces eyewitness testimonies and friendships from there, like the Gospels we have, and they dismiss that, what you find is they're very dismissive, but they don't have an answer for how the others originated and slipped by all the churches unanimously. That the churches unanimously accepted unidentifiable documents from unidentifiable sources, from unidentifiable regions, and all over the world, they accepted them all as the Gospels, directly given to them by apostles, but they don't know how. Now, maybe somebody would say the churches were that dumb and the people that were that just not on guard and dismissive of anything that, or they were accepting of everything, I should say, that just seemed likely or likable. But that's inconsistent with what we see because they dismiss other gospels that are more likable in their storytelling and more personal in the resurrection narratives, like the Gospel of Peter. Why not produce a person of interest? Why not produce a Christian community name or a region or a church? Because they can't. They can't. They can only dismiss the ones that have been posed unanimously, independently from all over the world, but they cannot produce one person, one location, one church, one bishop who would have done all this. So they're dismissive, but in a court of law, that won't work. You can dismiss the evidence all you want, but you need to produce counter evidence, and there is none. There is none. So number one, to dismiss Mark as Peter's interpreter is to pose a hypothesis that the writers were unknown first century Christian or Christians, and to condemn somebody as guilty without even producing an actual person of interest in replacement of the one that is being discussed. Though Mark was not an eyewitness of Jesus, he faithfully translated or interpreted Peter's oral testimony of Jesus to give a written account that would exist long after Peter's oral tradition would perish, as I said before. Peter may claim that he knew Mark when authorizing his first epistle. In 1 Peter 5:13, he clearly knew him. This person of interest can also be validated by multiple historical sources, as we talked about: Papias, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Jerome, and there's others that we just don't have time to get into, who are all testifying from apostolic churches who were started by the apostles themselves. Very important to remember. So let's get into the internal evidence. So externally, there's really no dispute. Not within what the claims are, there is not. But internally, can we identify accuracy in addition to what we just read externally? Because if Mark's gospel is truly Petrine, and it's truly based on Peter's perspective, and he is the author telling the story, Can someone investigate the documents internally and find Petrine perspectives within the narrative? That's the question that has to be answered. I think so. I think so. Let me give you a couple of reasons. Mark's gospel has the highest frequency of references to Peter in comparison to all the other gospels. You can see really the layout of that within Baucham's work and Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which I actually have a copy of and I would recommend, because I told you in the last program that we're going to be referencing him quite a bit. Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Baucham, who did a wonderful job. I don't agree with his conclusions on everything, certainly not on the authorship of John, but again, I give him credit for his reasoning and can't argue too much with him on some of it. But needless to say, he makes great arguments for the inclusio eyewitness testimonies within these, as well as the correspondence between Mark's gospel and the finalization of that with John's gospel, which we'll get into more when we hit John than actually hitting Mark. But I'll introduce it today at the end of the program. Mark's gospel has the highest frequency of references to Peter. Now note that carefully. His name isn't mentioned the most, but if you take the amount of words in Mark's gospel, which is shorter than Luke and Matthew, say, the amount of times Peter's used in that amount of words in comparison to larger amount of words, the highest frequency of Peter is in Mark's gospel. Now, that does not instantly mean, well, I guess Peter's the writer or the author behind it, and all of them are right. What we're doing here is we're looking at small and big things to see if they're correct. Okay, so we have a person of interest, in this case, people of interest, Mark and Peter. It's a testimony of really Peter's sermons in Rome that have been collected orally and put to words on a written form. Peter approved it. But if that's true, we should see signs and indicators that is accurate. I would make the argument that it is. These are indicators. In some ways, they're small. Not one of them can make the argument, but they can aid the argument. So what I'm saying is, some of these things I'm going to share with you don't make the argument, they aid the argument. The argument is the eyewitness testimonies of those that knew the apostles are stating this is how we got Mark. We're trying to fact check them internally and see if these indicators are true. Now, if this was truly Peter's gospel, well, then we should see some Petrine perspective or a little bit of Petrine's audience, or Peter's going to be the main figure out of the apostolic group. And it just so happens that in Mark's gospel, Peter has the most frequent appearances when you look at the comparison of words for the entire narrative in comparison to Matthew, John, and Luke. 2, it includes the Petrine inclusio eyewitness testimony, which again is a big argument by Richard Baucham in his book, which there really is some good initiations of that going on at the end of Mark and then at the end of John. But again, we will jump more into that as we go. But within this inclusio eyewitness testimony, there's going to be evidence of that, and it's going to look a certain way. For example, Baucham introduces the plural to singular narrative device that was introduced in 1925 by Cuthbert Turner, which was published in an article demonstrating that there's a certain device that's only in Mark's gospel. And I'm going to bring a few examples to show you. We won't do all 21. Where there does seem to be an oral tradition behind the written text, as if somebody's telling the story from their perspective. And that has to be translated into written text. Or if you use the word Papias and Tertullian and Irenaeus used, interpreted or given that hermeneutic. So Baucham points to this writing, this article published by Turner, and he mentions 21 times this device is used, this plural to singular narrative device. Now, I'll try to break this down for you in a second. Turner argued in this article that a characteristic aspect of Mark's narrative shows that the story was told from the perspective of the number of the 12, being the apostolic group. And this is due to Mark reproducing Peter's story from within that narrative. So Turner's saying there's a story being told, and the story is being told from somebody that was there. And Mark is happened to be on the outside reproducing this story to his readers, trying to put them to the oral tradition that's being told from somebody who is not going to be reading it, but actually listening to a sermon. Again, so if that sounds confusing, this is what I'm saying. Peter, if this is true, Peter's telling the story about when he was there and what he heard, what he saw. And he's telling it from an insider's perspective. He's preaching the sermon from the insider's perspective. Mark's on the outside having to translate that to his reader, and it's going to look a certain way in the written form in order to accurately convey the oral form, which is what Papias said happened. He brought no fault to it, and he interpreted it accurately as he heard it. So if Papias is telling the truth, there should be evidence of that. Well, Turner makes the argument there's 21 places you can do that. Now, again, we're not going to look at all of it, but let's interpret what the plural to singular narrative device is. It is a plural verb without any explicit subject, which, again, is not proper writing. We do that when we speak. We preach sermons or give a presentation at a school, or we're teaching a class. We do it often. Even I probably have done it a few times in this show. We make statements without always giving a specific subject. But in writing, you can't do that because you're not getting the full context as you would in a traditional or an oral tradition sermon or an oral tradition speaking arrangement. So it's very important in writing to have a verb that attaches to the subject producing a specific subject, an explicit subject, producing the action or receiving the action. Well, in this plural to singular narrative device, we find something in Mark's gospel that doesn't show up in the other gospels, and that is that there's a lot of plural verbs without any explicit subject. It's used to describe the movement, and this is when you find these 21 instances. When Jesus and disciples are on the move somewhere, on a ship, walking to another village in another town, you see this happen frequently. And then it's followed immediately by a singular verb or pronoun referring to Jesus alone. Now, if that doesn't make sense to you, I'm going to show you examples. But I'm just defining it at this point. And what I'm trying to share with you is this. It's clear that if you're going to have an oral tradition made to a written, you're going to find some complications on the written side, because written traditions don't do well if they're trying to write out an oral tradition, because oral traditions and written traditions are really formatted differently. But if you're trying to be accurate and write what Peter's saying, if you're really Mark, then you're going to be accurate, even if it's not considered good writing. And I think that's what happens in some of these circumstances. It is most often used when Jesus' disciples are moving from place to place. It focused primarily on the eyewitnesses who traveled with Jesus. So the perspective is being told from somebody on the inside of the group and their encounters with Jesus in those events. So you're taking their story and trying to write it. And in doing so, you're going to lose sometimes an explicit subject because you're not focusing on the eyewitness. You're focusing on the person who the eyewitness is telling you about. And that would be Jesus. So let's take a look. Examples. Mark 5, 1 through 2. They came to the other side of the sea. Catch it. They came. You have the plural. You don't have an identifiable subject. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he had stepped on the boat. So you have this. Notice it went from plural, they, to singular, he. But you have no identifiable subject. And so Mark, again, if he is interpreting what Peter's trying to say here in a text way versus an oral way. He's hearing Peter say out loud, we came to the other side of the sea in the country, and he stepped out on the boat. Mark has to go, okay, the people that were with him came to the other side of the sea, the country of the Gerasene. And when he stepped out of the boat, so these people are coming, they're coming to listen. The eyewitness is telling the story, and Jesus steps out on the boat. Another illustration is in chapter 11, verse 12. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, they, plural, he, singular, was hungry. Why the switch? Why not the identifiable? Why not say who? Why switch? Typically, proper writing goes this way. They came to the other side of the sea and they stepped off the boat. Because it's if you're telling the story from out here, the 20,000 foot view, you're following the movement. They got on the boat and went to the other side of the sea, and they got off the boat. That makes sense. Because you, as somebody telling the story, is looking at the group. But if you're on the inside telling the story, and an outsider has to interpret it, they are the group of apostles. And then reporting what happened is going to be from somebody in the they telling what happened. For example, Jesus stepped off the boat. Jesus was hungry. How do you know that? Somebody within the they shared the story. So Mark, if he's on the outside interpreting what happened from the inside, he's going to report the they and then describe the he that they are reporting of. And again, this may be confusing, but if you just follow the pattern, and it's hard to do because in your brain, when you're listening to this, you have to translate oral tradition to written tradition to the reader. If somebody on the inside is telling the story, and then somebody's reporting that in a written tradition, they're going to have to describe who's telling the story from the insider's position and what happened. And sometimes that's going to look like this. They are doing the traveling, but they are focusing on the individual, he, Jesus. Another example. They went to the place called Gethsemane, and he said, again, they is the group being reported. And based on what they said, he started speaking these words. So again, it's an indicator that somebody on the inside of the they is reporting what he said, what he did, that he was hungry, or that he stepped off the boat. But you're going from the plural to the singular. Not good writing if you're telling an overarching story. Summary. In these parallel passages with the synoptics, it's clear that Matthew and Luke seem to prefer the singular verb to Mark's plural. When you compare these passages, and again, we're not looking at all 21, we don't have time, it's a short program. You look at all these passages, you have a singular usage in Matthew and Luke. Why not Mark? Why not? It could be because Mark is telling the story from a textual perspective off the basis of an oral tradition from somebody who was a part of the they, who knew Jesus was hungry because he was there, knew Jesus stepped off the boat because he was there, knew they went into the garden, he said these words because he was there. That's different. That's different from somebody who's just reporting what happened. Because you're reporting what happened from the inside. And the person that's having to write down the interpretation of the oral narrative to a written audience is going to now change improperly to keep up with the oral tradition, the verbs and the nouns and the pronouns, and not give explicit subjects and actually change it from plural to singular. When you compare it to Mark, with Mark, Matthew, and Luke, Mark's the only one that uses these types of styles in these passages when telling a story of the disciples and Jesus moving together in a company, going from place to place. These narratives are told from the experience of an eyewitness with his companions. Mark is giving the narrative from an insider's perspective, whereas Matthew and Luke are giving a narrative from an outsider's perspective, concentrating their focus on a central figure being Jesus Christ himself. The reasons to believe it's Peter. 1, we find him at times speaking on behalf of the group. Here's more reasons. We have reasons to believe so in the frequency of Peter's name, the fact that this seems definitely to correspond with the allegation that these are interpreted sayings into written text from oral. And when we look at the texts themselves, we have reasons to believe it's Peter because we find him at times speaking on behalf of the group, the apostles that traveled. Why is he the one doing the speaking? Because in John's gospel, it's not as much the case. Mark 10:28 is a perfect example of this. Now, I'll read these really quick because I think it's important to see them. But in Mark's gospel, we have indicators that Peter is the spokesman for the they. As I stated, we're going to see when we get to John, it's not going to be any time in the next couple of weeks, but when we get to John, we're going to see illustrations of where John has the other perspective from his worldview, not from Peter's. He talks about Peter, but it's not from his worldview. It's from John's worldview. Verse 28 of chapter 10, Peter began to say to him, behold, we have left everything and have followed you. Peter is the one that's speaking on behalf of the group. We find him being addressed in place of the whole group. Here's a verse for you on the screen, Mark 14:37. Then he came and found them sleeping. That's Jesus came while they were in the garden, and he found them, being Peter, James, and John, asleep. And he said to Peter, wait, what? He said to Peter, Simon, are you, singular, sleeping? Couldn't you stay awake for 1 hour? Stay awake and pray so that you, plural, Peter, James, and John, won't enter into temptation. Oh, wait a minute. Don't miss that. Don't read past that and not see the changes. Now, the King James does a better job of pronouns in English, showing you the singular and verb. These, thou, with thee, thou, and thine, and so forth. But I've done it for you. It's right here. Jesus came and saw them, Peter, James, and John, sleeping. And he addressed Peter and said directly to Peter, Simon. Now, wait a minute. Why the name change? Why did the writer, if he is faking this, he's making this up out of thin air, why say Peter and then have Jesus speaking Simon instead of Peter? See, to me, these are important details that get skipped over and they're not discussed enough, or they're dismissed so quickly. You're making this up. I'll give you a perfect example. In the Gospel of Peter, he makes sure you know quite a bit that he is Peter. At the very end of the gospel account that we have, where it's cut off in the manuscript, he states these words: I, Simon Peter, and my brother Andrew. The Gnostic texts are enamored with making sure you understand they are Thomas, they are Mary, they are Peter. Very, very careful to make sure they're calling out who they are. First century biographies are not that way. It is not uncommon, and in fact, it is very common for a writer who is writing not about Peter, but about Jesus, to not make Peter the point by saying, I, Simon Peter, or I, John the Apostle. Although John kind of hints at his own self at the very end. Or I, Matthew. Because why wouldn't they just say it? Why don't they just say they're Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Because that's not proper writing when you're doing a biography. If you're doing an autobiography, that's fine in the first century. And by the way, this is not unusual. You can find this in Roman literature. Josephus did this when he was telling stories about himself in the war. He changed the way he talked about himself when he's dealing with circumstances that he was in and a part of versus ones he's writing about that others were a part of. He changes it. And you see indicators here That the point is not about Peter. This story is not Peter's story. It's Peter telling a story about Jesus. And the way you see indicators of that is right here. Jesus comes and finds them sleeping, and the one that's telling the story is going to tell it from his perspective. And here he is singled out. And he is saying, now, so Mark writes, and he said to Peter, and then he quotes what Peter said. And Peter heard not Peter's name from Jesus, his name before it was changed to Peter, Simon. If you're making this story up, you're just going to stay consistent with the name. You're not going to change it up. But if you're telling the story from the insider's perspective, and Peter's preaching a sermon and said, Jesus said to me, Simon, are you sleeping? Mark has to translate that to a written form of a biography about Jesus, not Peter. And so what he's going to interpret, the hermeneutic is, he said to Peter in front of me. And then he's going to put Peter's quote, Simon, because Mark can write what Peter said because he's hearing Peter saying it. But he can't write the words of Jesus because he wasn't there. He can write what Peter heard Jesus say to him. And the word for word quote was, Simon, not Peter, Simon, are you singular sleeping? But wait a minute. So you have that aspect, but you also have the aspect of, wait a minute. Why is he addressing just Peter? John was sleeping. James was sleeping. Because Peter's telling the story from his inside view. And notice how he goes back to the plural. Stay awake and pray so you, Peter, James, and John, won't enter into temptation. So Jesus had a message for all three of them, but he's directly addressing Peter as if he's addressing the whole group. Just like we see Peter speaking on behalf of the whole group. Why? Because this is Peter's story. We find a combination of both. Mark 11, 21 through 22. Then Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you curse is withered. Jesus replied to them, the whole group, have faith in God. Why is Mark's gospel pointing to Peter remembering something? How would Mark know what Peter remembered? Well, if Peter said he remembered, it's pretty easy just to go, Peter remembered what Jesus said that day. And what Peter said to him. Peter said, Rabbi, look, the tree you curse is withered. And then he goes back into the narrative where Jesus said to all of his disciples, have faith in God. So you see a combination of Peter speaking on behalf of the whole group and Peter being answered and addressed in place of the whole group, both in the same exact 2 verses. How would he know what Peter remembered unless Peter told him what he remembered? This is important. Reasons to believe it's Peter. Number 4, we find that when Peter is on the scene, Peter's perspective is given more detail in comparison to the other apostles. We'll look at one example. We see it in 8:27 through 33. We see it in 14:27 through 3. Let's look at an example here in Mark 9, 5 through 6. Peter's motives are disclosed to the reader. We just gave another example of that just a second ago. Like his thought process was exposed. But Mark 9, 5 through 6, it says, Peter responded and said to Jesus, Rabbi, it's good that we are here. Let's make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. For he did not know how to reply, for they became terrified. Peter's motives are being exposed. Peter responded and said, Jesus, Rabbi, it's good that we are here. Let us make 3 tabernacles for you, Moses, and Elijah. For he did not know how to reply. How did anybody know Peter's motives unless they were disclosed by somebody who was there like Peter? To me, it's clear. Peter is telling the story. Mark is writing what happened to Peter. Who else would be able to report what happened there except for Peter, James, or John? Mark 14, 54 through 72. And again, there's others where you find Peter on the scene in Peter's perspective and is given more detail in comparison to the other apostles. There's other examples. Just read at 8:27-33, read 14:27 and following the 30. But what about here in Mark 14? Peter is physically removed from the other disciples and his story is told apart from the others. Peter is removed from all the others in the group, and it is his story that's being told. He is the one finalizing and closing the end of the story from his perspective. Reason number 5. Peter understanding or having a misunderstanding of Jesus often sets the tone for the narrative. The whole book is launched on the next scene is based on Peter either getting something and understanding it or not getting it. For example, Mark 8:29-33, Peter makes one of the greatest proclamations of the person of Christ, only to be called Satan by Jesus a few statements later due to his ignorance. Jesus says, I'm going to go, I'm going to die. Peter says, no, you're not. No, you're not. Peter is making one of the greatest proclamations in one scene. You're the Christ. You're the Son of the living God. You are the Messiah. Jesus says, okay, well, I'm going to go and I'm going to die. And he says, no, you're not. And then the next statements of direction in the narrative are launched from Peter understanding or misunderstanding who Jesus is, what he said, and what he did. The narrative follows Peter's perspectives, his understandings and misunderstandings. Another example of that is in chapter 14, verse 29. Peter makes the bold proclamation of loyalty above the other disciples. And by verse 66-72, he's denying Christ altogether. Hey, they may abandon you, but I won't. By the end of the story, he's denying Christ altogether. The whole story is launched from his perspective of what he says, what he understands or misunderstands. His success and his failure is the starting points of the narratives about Jesus. Indicators that Peter is the one behind these stories. Number 6, Peter's involvement in gaining knowledge of the resurrection was distinguished from the others when the women delivered the message from the angels. So at the very end of the book, and I'll read it to you, verse 7 of chapter 16, Peter's involvement in gaining the knowledge about what happened with the resurrection is different. It's distinguished from the others when the women delivered. Chapter 16, verse 6, 16, verse 7, you have these words, go tell his disciples, catch it, and Peter. He's going ahead of you to Galilee, and there he will see him just as he told you. What's up with that? Peter gains knowledge of the resurrection, and he's not included with the others. He's distinguished. Let me read it again. Go tell his disciples. This is the angel's message. And Peter. He is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Why and Peter? Because this is Peter telling the story. The inclusio eyewitness format is the 7th reason. It's used in the beginning and the ending of the narrative. Peter is the first introduced figure on the scene. A good evidence of inclusio eyewitness within a testimony of a narrative like these is to find who does the narrative start with in their perspective and who does it end with. In Mark chapter 1, you have the introduction of John the Baptist. But when it comes to the inside group of Jesus, you have verse 14. Now, after John was taken into custody, Jesus came to Galilee and he started preaching the gospel. And in verse 16, as he was going along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon. So precedence and first indicator is Peter starts this whole thing. Yes, we have John the Baptist, but when it comes to somebody that's being a part of the telling of a story, when Jesus shows up on the scene in the narrative, he's going to introduce you to his crowd that followed him. It's not in Mark, Andrew. You say, why does that matter? Well, when we get to John, you're going to see Peter's not the first one introduced, because the inclusio testimony witness of John's gospel is not Peter. He comes after Andrew. But in the storytelling from Peter's perspective, the inclusio eyewitness testimony that's given when you're writing a biography of somebody is to give them a hint at the involvement of the person giving you the material by starting with them over the other. And he does it two ways. He starts with Peter. And then when he introduces Andrew, he makes sure to introduce Andrew as Peter's brother. Why isn't it Andrew and Peter his brother, being Andrew's brother? Why is it going to be Andrew, the brother of Peter? Because the precedence is given to the eyewitness testimony, and the inclusio eyewitness here is Peter. And then you end, we just looked at it, it ends with his involvement of Peter. By verse 7, it says, tell the disciples and Peter. Why? Because in the writing of inclusio testimony witness, you have to end with the person of interest you start with, and you started with Peter and you ended with Peter. You go check John. It's not that way. It's not Peter. And Peter doesn't get the last statement in John's gospel. John does. And we'll see that as we go into the detail. 8, the writer protects the identity of Peter in potential criminal situations. Chapter 14, verse 47, when they're in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter whips out a sword, hacks off the ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest. Jesus picks up the ear, heals it. How in the world and why in the world does Mark not tell us it was Peter? John does. Matthew doesn't. Luke doesn't. Because by doing that, you're admitting, you're giving admittance to committing a criminal activity of attempted murder. So naturally, Peter's not going to go, and there I was in the garden, just swinging away. No, he's going to say a disciple did it, and from protective anonymity standpoint, not share that information. Which, by the way, you got to ask yourself why Mark and Matthew and Luke don't give that information, but Peter does. Excuse me, but John does of Peter, saying it's Peter. Something happened from those three gospels to John that may have introduced a reason as to why John disclosed him and the other three didn't. And by the way, there's more situations in that one that we'll get into when we get to John. So compare that with John 18, 10 through 11, and 25 through 27. So these are the notes. These are the notes that we're looking at today when we deal with the inclusio eyewitness testimony. These reasons that Mark's gospel seems to be Peter's. We have historical reason to believe it. We have historical attestation. We can corroborate independent witnesses from all over the world saying the same thing. When we look internally, we find hints. We find multiple hints that what Papias claimed, what Irenaeus claimed, what Clement of Alexandria claimed, what Tertullian claimed, what Origen and Jerome claimed, what we are finding is internally there's consistency, especially with the object that Dr. Turner presented in 1925 about these 21 plural to singular devices. You can definitely see oral tradition being translated into written, which is why what I believe Papias was saying when he said it was interpreted, I believe, and what Tertullian said it, and Irenaeus said it, what I believe he was saying was he interpreted by taking an oral tradition and making it a written one. And in doing so, it wasn't the best writing, which is why Peter's gospel or Mark's gospel is very choppy. I don't know if you've noticed that. It's not like clean transitions like you see in Luke. It's very choppy, and it's not in order. It's very much something that seems to be very cut and dry, but not very transitional in times. But that makes sense if it was being orally preached and Mark's just copying what was orally preached and translating, if you would, or interpreting. Peter's telling the story, so then he has to write it like, so if Peter says it this way, Jesus said to me, so Mark has to come over here in written form and go, Jesus said to Peter. Because he can't say Jesus said to me, because Peter's not writing it, Mark's interpreting it. And that's not good first century biography. It's making it about Peter. But if you're giving Peter credit as the eyewitness, you include Peter's name so you know the credibility. By the way, this is not uncommon. We're going to talk about this when we get to Luke's gospel. When you get to the two disciples of the road of Emmaus, have you ever wondered why he gave the name of one of the disciples Cleopas and not the other? That's an indicator from the writer that is information about the story he's giving precedent to the one guy that was there over the other, which means Luke probably learned that story from Cleopas, not the unnamed man. And by giving credit to his source, he gives his name and silences the other, or gives precedence by naming him first and giving the other guy an attachment to that person, just like we saw in Mark's gospel when you have Peter and then Andrew, the brother of Peter. You're still bringing it back to Peter, even when you introduce the second character. You see it in the Gospels. It's not a bunch of made up guys of unknown provenance sitting together saying, let's make up a story about Jesus and let's do it this way. That's not the way you would do it. We see evidence of that in the Gnostic Gospels. They don't do it that way. So with all that being said, that's Mark's Gospel. We'll come in and see some of the comments real quick, and then we'll exit out of here. First name, last name says, I really love what you guys are doing here. This is a blessing. Thanks for sharing that with us. And I appreciate all the comments that I'm getting on the side of my messenger as well. Finding Truth says, super interesting stuff. Rachel jumped in, made a point, says Stephen, excuse me, Stephen makes a well-built case. Thank you for sharing that, Rachel. And what it needs to be said is this: we need to stop letting secular scholarship dismiss things that have great validity because it doesn't fit their narrative. They say, well, you're biased. Well, your bias is to excuse every evidence that comes in front of you and call it bias. We have to make a good argument that's constructed from good external, good internal testimony. I hope this program will help you and others as you listen. Feel free to comment after the video, share it with others. Please post it and share it. These are issues I've debated. I've done multiple debates on this, done multiple speaking arrangements on this. This is something that I am convinced of, that these are based on eyewitness testimonies, and it can be historically argued and intrinsically argued. There will be others. We'll jump into Matthew's gospel next. We'll do 2 on Matthew, 2 on Luke, 2 on John. Stay tuned for posted blogs and articles that'll be coming out on the website. If you look at below on the bottom of the screen, you have explorechristianity.net. We have other things that are going on in our network. We have multiple apologists that have different studies and emphasis at Explore. We got guys in philosophy, guys that do work in things like Egyptology, and guys that are interested in the sciences, guys that are interested in Old Testament studies, cults, multiple avenues that we're studying and researching. Currently, our whole group is working on the side on a discussion on the Mosaic authorship of Torah, looking at the defense of whether Moses did write the 5 books of the Pentateuch. Can that be proven historically and intrinsically, just like we're doing with the Gospels? You'll start seeing in the next 6 months or so posts, blogs, videos, debates on that as well. Please check us out on our website, also our YouTube channel. You can like and subscribe as you're watching here. Please, if you are not a follower of Explore Christianity and you enjoy videos like this, please just do the simple task of hitting like and subscribe right there on YouTube. If you follow me on Facts on the Spotify channel and Apple and other avenues that do Facts podcasts, please like, subscribe on there too. Follow us, share our work. We really appreciate it. Thank you for tuning in today. Trust this program was a blessing to you. Grace and peace to you. Blessings on this Saturday. May the Lord bless you on the Lord's Day tomorrow as you go to his house and worship with his people.